Hello and welcome to the Roger's Take podcast. I'm your host, Roger. Okay, so a few days ago was June 19th or Juneteenth, which is our newest federal holiday as of 2021 by President Joe Biden. The holiday is in observance of an event that took place on June 19th, 1865. On that day, members of the Union Army entered Texas and informed the enslaved Africans there that the Civil War was now over and that they were now free. Every year since, these formerly enslaved Africans have been celebrating that day as the day that slavery actually ended. Then, in 1980, the day became a state holiday in Texas known as Emancipation Day. But my question is whether especially African Americans should be observing this day at all, or if yes, should it be observed by celebrating or by simply acknowledging that the fight for justice continues? Now, this is a valid question because there are many facts about Juneteenth that were never really made clear, including the event itself. Okay, so firstly, Juneteenth came about as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation, which Abraham Lincoln signed on September 22nd of 1862, and which went into effect on January 1st of 1863. This all occurred while the country was in the midst of the Civil War. And although the Union Army had made, some advances into the Confederate States, there were heavy casualties on both sides, and the remaining Confederate states were showing no signs of surrendering. So with this as a backdrop, the Emancipation Proclamation was therefore drawn up as a wartime maneuver and was more of an ultimatum, not so much to free the slaves, but to end the war and reunite the country. Further, it was directed at those Confederate states that had not yet been advanced on by the Union Army and were continuing their rebellion. The proclamation basically said that you either stop your rebellion and rejoin your Union within 100 days, or I, President Lincoln, would free the slaves. Now, the rationale here was that the freeing of the slaves would be economically devastating to the Confederate States, and in itself would help bring an end to the war. However, the enforcement of the proclamation and freeing of the slaves would be totally dependent on the further advancement of the Union Army into the remaining rebellious states. So needless to say, these states did not give in to the ultimatum. And 100 days later, January 1st of 1863, Lincoln's proclamation went into effect. Then 2 years later, in 1865, the Union Army had advanced into and freed the slaves in the aforementioned rebellious states. Then on June 19th of that same year, the Union Army entered the last remaining rebellious state of Texas, and Juneteenth was born. But contrary to popular belief, Juneteenth did not end slavery. Why? Because slavery continued in the states of Delaware and Kentucky. Why? Because despite being slave states, they had never seceded from the Union and were never part of the Confederacy. Therefore, the Emancipation Proclamation or ultimatum did not apply to them. Okay, so it's obvious and clear that slavery did not end on Juneteenth, and nor were all the slaves freed. Then on December 6, 1865, the historic 13th Amendment, which legally abolished slavery as it existed, was ratified and became law. Now, Lincoln, who had been assassinated by this time, was a strict abolitionist and put his full support behind the legislation and even signed the bill before it was presented to Congress and later to the states for ratification on February 1st of 1865. Georgia was the 27th state to ratify the amendment, and 27 states was all that was necessary to make it law. But some states, most notably Mississippi, were very slow at ratifying the amendment. And although their ratification was not needed at this point, it nonetheless took 148 years for Mississippi to ratify and certify the amendment on March 18 of 2013. The other states that were slow or reluctant to ratify the amendment, but again, whose ratification was not needed at this point, was Kentucky at 111 years to ratify in 1976, and Delaware at 36 years to ratify in 1901. But although the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, this action was followed by a new kind of slavery in the form of black codes, Jim Crow laws, the KKK, lynchings, massacres, and destruction of black townships, and the list goes on. And even today, mostly southern states are passing laws that many have described as Jim Crow all over again. These laws have resulted in a massive reduction of polling places in black communities, as well as extremely excessive wait times to vote when compared to white communities. The goal of these and other such efforts are the same as the goal of the southern states after slavery was initially abolished, and that is to disenfranchise African Americans and almost guarantee that white racists, including MAGA extremists, would be elected. This would enable them to continue to pass local Jim Crow-like laws that are veiled in such a way that today's conservative Supreme Court could very conceivably declare that these laws are constitutional. This, of course, would be a devastating setback to the ongoing fight for justice in this country. And the best defense against this, frankly, is for African Americans to know their history, remain vigilant and aware of current events, and to be politically active. This all brings me back to the question at hand, which is whether Juneteenth should be observed by celebrating or by commemorating the event and acknowledging the continued struggle and fight for justice. For me, the obvious answer is commemoration. Why? Because while many have referred to June 19th, 1865 as being a pivotal point in the U.S., the actual pivot was in the direction of a more complex and veiled kind of slavery that is verified by the history books and current events. But to be clear, I do not condemn those formerly enslaved Africans in Texas for celebrating. Why? Because it was a knee-jerk reaction to being told that after being shackled and enslaved for generations, you are suddenly free. In addition, they didn't have the benefit of the history that we have today to help put Juneteenth in its proper perspective. So yes, the original formerly enslaved Africans in Texas get a pass for celebrating because they had every right to do so. But moving on, if this brand new federal holiday is going to be observed, it should be in the form of commemoration and acknowledgement that slavery did not end on Juneteenth, and nor were all the slaves freed, because that particular distinction goes to the 13th Amendment on December 6th of 1865. And even that event marked our generational struggle and fight for justice and true freedom. But what do you think? Do you agree or disagree? I'd like to hear your comment. And as always, if you like the show, please subscribe.